Imagine standing in a place where the wind whispers secrets it has kept for 2,500 years. Here, beneath your feet, once stood walls so vast that ancient writers claimed chariots could race 4 abreast along their summit. Here stood gates clad in brilliant blue glazed brick, where bulls and dragons fashioned from gold leaf gazed down upon processions of kings and priests and captives. Here stood a ziggurat so immense that its summit seemed to touch the heavens, a tower that would pass into legend as the Tower of Babel. Here stood gardens so lush, so impossibly green in the middle of the Mesopotamian desert that Greek travelers would later name them among the 7 wonders of the world. This place was called Babylon. For nearly 2,000 years, longer than the entire history of Christianity, longer than the rise and fall of Rome, Babylon stood at the center of the civilized world. It was the cultural capital of antiquity, the religious heart of Mesopotamia, the city where gods dwelt among mortals, where kings derived their legitimacy from divine favor, where law and literature and science reached heights that would not be equaled for millennia. And then, on a single day in October of 539 BC, it ended. An army appeared on the eastern horizon. They were not Elamites, not Assyrians, not any enemy Babylon had faced before. They came from Persia, from the mountains and plateaus beyond the Zagros range. Their leader was a man named Cyrus, a king whose name would echo through history as the Great. The last king of Babylon, a religious fanatic named Nabonidus, waited behind his city's walls. He had abandoned the gods of Babylon for a lunar deity named Sin. He had neglected the sacred rituals, the New Year's festival, the moment when the king took the hand of the god Marduk and reaffirmed the cosmic order. The priests of Marduk seethed with resentment. The people murmured in the streets, and when Cyrus came, the gates opened. The Persian army entered Babylon without a battle. The chronicles record it simply. On the 16th day, Ugbaru, governor of Gutium, and the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without battle. Afterwards, Nabonidus was arrested in Babylon when he returned there. A kingdom that had ruled Mesopotamia for over a millennium fell in a single day. No siege, no sack, no slaughter, just surrender. But this is not where the story of Babylon begins. It is where it ends. To understand how the greatest city of the ancient world could fall so quietly, how a king could be so hated that his own people would open the gates to a foreign conqueror, we must go back. Back through 2,000 years of blood and fire. Back through empires that rose and crumbled into dust. Back through the reigns of kings whose names still resonate across the millennia. Back to the beginning. This is the story of Babylon, the city at the center of the world. To understand the rise of Babylon, we must first understand the world that preceded it. At the end of the 3rd millennium BC, all Mesopotamia was dominated by a single superpower, the Neo-Sumerian Empire, ruled by the 3rd dynasty of Ur. For just over a century, the kings of Ur presided over a golden age. They ruled from the shores of the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. They controlled trade routes that stretched as far as India and Egypt. They promoted literature and the arts in the ancient Sumerian language, preserving the cultural heritage of a civilization that was already millennia old. The greatest of these kings was Shulgi, who reigned for 48 years. He built magnificent temples, reformed the administration of the empire, and declared himself a god in his own lifetime. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, towered above the desert plain, a visible symbol of divine power on earth. It was, as far as we know, the largest religious structure of its age. But even golden ages do not last forever. The seeds of Ur's destruction were planted by forces beyond its control. From the western deserts, semi-nomadic peoples known as Amorites began migrating into Mesopotamia. The Sumerians and Akkadians viewed them with suspicion. They were Mar-Tiyu, a Sumerian term that meant something like barbarians. A Sumerian text from the period captures this disdain. The Mar-Tiyu, who know no grain, who have no house during their lifetime, who are not buried after death. But the Amorites kept coming. They settled on the fringes of cities. They served as mercenaries in armies. They gradually infiltrated the social and political fabric of Mesopotamia. By the time Ibbi-Sin ascended the throne of Ur around 2028 BC, the empire was unraveling. Provinces were breaking away. Enemy peoples were pressing at the borders, and the Amorites were no longer just a nuisance. They were an existential threat. We know the desperation of Ibbi-Sin's final years because his letters survive. Clay tablets baked by time, preserving the words of a king watching his world collapse. One of his commanders was a man named Ishbi-Era. Ibbi-Sin ordered him to travel to the cities of Isin and Kazalu, purchase large quantities of grain, and bring it back to Ur. But Ishbi-Era replied that he could not carry out the king's orders. "Say to my lord," he wrote, "this is what Ishbi-Era, your servant, says. You ordered me to travel to Isin and Kazalu to purchase grain. I heard news that the hostile Amorites have entered inside your territories. I entered with 72,000 gur of grain inside Isin. Because of the Amorites, I am unable to hand over this grain for threshing. They are stronger than me, while I am condemned to sitting around." Ibbi-Sin was trapped. The Amorites controlled the roads. His own commander was effectively independent. He had no choice but to agree when Ishbi-Era demanded to be made governor of Nippur and Isin, cities he already controlled in all but name. And then, in 2017 BC, Ishbi-Era made his move. He declared himself king of Isin, the very city he had once pledged to protect for Ibbi-Sin. The governor of Kazalu, a loyalist named Puzur-Nummushta, sent a desperate letter to Ibbi-Sin, reporting Ishbi-Era's treason. "To Ibbi-Sin, my lord, thus says Puzur-Nummushta, governor of Kazalu, your servant." The envoy of Ishbi-Era came to me and presented his case as follows. "My lord Enlil has promised to make me shepherd of this land. I have sworn by the name of my personal god, Dagon, that I shall conquer Kazalu. Since Enlil has promised me the cities of the land, I shall build shrines to all the gods in Isin." The land trembles like a reed fence from his clamor. Ishbi-Era goes everywhere at the head of his troops. Ishbi-Era's clamor has become loud, and now he has cast his eyes in my direction. I have no ally, no one who could compete with him. Ibbi-Sin could do nothing. His empire was already dead. It simply had not been buried yet. The final blow came from the east. The Elamites, once vassals of Ur, had declared their independence under a king named Kindatu. In 2004 BC, Kindatu marched on Ur with a great army. The city fell. Ibbi-Sin was captured and taken to Alam, in chains. The statue of Nana, the moon god, the patron deity of Ur, was carried away as plunder. The third dynasty of Ur was no more. The fall of Ur was a watershed moment. It ushered in an era of fragmentation, a time when no single power dominated Mesopotamia. In the south, the kings of Esan claimed to be the heirs of Ur's legacy. In the north, new powers were emerging, and everywhere, Amorite chieftains were carving out kingdoms for themselves. One of those kingdoms was centered on a small, unremarkable city along the Euphrates River. A city that in the local Akkadian language was called Babim, Gateway of the Gods. Some scholars believe the original Sumerian name may have been Babar or Babur, meaning pale white or bright. We know it as Babylon. In the year 1894 BC, a relatively unknown Amorite chieftain named Sumu-abum established a small kingdom along what was then the eastern banks of the Euphrates River. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about this place. It had decent agricultural land. It possessed a modest city known in Akkadian as Babu. But in Sumu-abum's time, the future grandeur of the city was invisible. It was not yet the greatest cult center of southern Mesopotamia. It was not yet the political master of the region. It was one among many. And perhaps that is exactly why its rise is so compelling. Babylon did not inherit supremacy. It built it. The first kings of the dynasty worked under conditions of constant instability. Around them stood older, richer, and more prestigious cities. There were stronger neighbors. There were river routes to secure, border settlements to fortify, and alliances to negotiate. The early Babylonian kings did not have the luxury of grandiose overreach. Their first task was survival. The available texts suggest fortification and consolidation. Sumu-abum and his successors strengthened defenses, expanded surrounding settlements, and cultivated the city's economic life. Babylon became known for fine textiles. This matters more than it might seem. A city does not become a political center by war alone. It becomes one by attracting labor, production, trade, and administrative gravity. The kings of Babylon fought, certainly. They also bargained. They made use of diplomacy and marriage alliances. They built small fortresses. They paid close attention to neighboring powers and to internal order. We even find letters from later in the dynasty worrying about foreign caravans behaving like spies. That detail captures the atmosphere of the age perfectly. Every caravan could be commerce. Every caravan could also be intelligence gathering. Borders were porous. Security was fragile. Information mattered. As Babylon grew, so did the pressures around it. To the southeast, Larsa was on the rise, benefiting from trade routes reaching toward the Gulf and from its strategic position in southern Mesopotamia. Under kings like Rimsin, it would become wealthy and formidable. To the north and northeast, Eshnunna and other regional powers maneuvered for control. Further north still, Shamshi-Adad would build a powerful Upper Mesopotamian empire stretching across key territories and threatening to dominate the political landscape from above. Babylon was not, at this stage, the master of events. It was a middle power in a dangerous world. That made each decision matter. The city could not afford foolish wars. It could not afford strategic blindness. It had to be patient. And patience, more than brute strength, was the quality that allowed Babylon to endure its early generations long enough for the decisive figure to arrive. That figure? was Hammurabi. But before Hammurabi entered the picture, the political field had to be prepared by decades of contest. The dynasty before him had already done crucial work. It had created a stable enough kingdom, defensible enough frontiers, and viable enough center that Babylon could become the launching ground for empire. Without that early, patient labor, Hammurabi would have inherited nothing more than a vulnerable town waiting to be crushed. Instead, he inherited a state with potential. Potential in history is dangerous. If it is not seized, someone else will seize it. Babylon was about to seize it. By the time Hammurabi came to the throne, the landscape of Mesopotamia was a complex and volatile web of competing kingdoms. The old Neo-Sumerian order was gone, but its shadow remained. Cities and dynasties sought legitimacy through inherited symbolism, through religious patronage, through literary continuity, and through claims of protecting the ancient centers of Sumer and Akkad. Yet behind all that continuity lay relentless rivalry. Essene and Larsa, two of the most important successor states in the south, had spent generations wrestling for dominance. Essene preserved many external forms of Neo-Sumerian culture, including the use of Sumerian in royal and literary contexts. Larsa, rising under Amorite rulers, proved more militarily dynamic. Over time, Larsa's fortunes grew while Essene weakened. By the reign of Rimsin, Larsa was the strongest power in southern Mesopotamia. Its control of trade routes from the Gulf and connections to resource flows made it wealthy. Its armies were capable. Its ruler was experienced and shrewd. But Larsa was not Babylon's only concern. To the northeast, the kingdom of Eshnunna occupied the Diyala region and expanded aggressively under kings like Naram-Sin of Eshnunna and his successors. Eshnunna was both a military power and an economic one, positioned close to eastern routes and capable of threatening lower Mesopotamia. Further west, Mari stood as one of the most important cities in the entire region. Located on the middle Euphrates, Mari controlled networks of communication and trade that linked Mesopotamia with Syria and beyond. It was both a kingdom and a hinge. Whoever held Mari influenced traffic, diplomacy, and strategy across wide spaces. And above all this, in the north, came the storm of Shamshi-Adad. Shamshi-Adad's story matters deeply because it shows the type of threat Babylon faced before it became dominant. Driven from his homeland after Eshnunna's aggression, he sought refuge in Babylon. Later, he returned, retook his position, and built an empire. He captured Assur, annexed territories, and eventually took Mari, establishing a major Upper Mesopotamian state. This was the kind of man the age produced, displaced one year, Imperial the next. Shamshi-Adad's empire was large, formidable, and dangerous. It represented an alternative center of gravity. If it had endured, Babylon's future might have been very different. But the ancient Near East was full of states that looked secure right up until the moment they suddenly were not. Shamshi-Adad died like so many rapidly built polities. His empire fragmented. The collapse created a vacuum. Mari regained independence under Zimri-Lium, a ruler backed by Yamhad to the west. The Upper Mesopotamian political field was thrown back into motion. Eshnunna sought opportunities. Larsa remained powerful in the south. Babylon watched, This was the world Hammurabi entered when he became king in 1792 BC. He did not step onto an empty stage. He stepped into a room full of armed men, each of whom believed he had a claim to greatness. The genius of Hammurabi would lie in understanding that he did not need to be stronger than all of them at the start. He only needed to outlast them, outmaneuver them, and strike when the pattern of their fear and ambition made them vulnerable. That kind of kingship is not glamorous in the beginning. It looks cautious. The early years of Hammurabi's reign were relatively quiet. He focused on financial matters, temple renovations, canal maintenance, and administrative stabilization. To modern eyes, that may seem like the dull prelude before the real story begins. In reality, it was the real story already underway. Because war rewards the state that has already done the boring work. An army marches because grain is accounted for. A siege succeeds because canals are controlled. A coalition holds because messages can be sent, gifts delivered, promises recorded, and supplies moved. Hammurabi was building all of that. Meanwhile, his rivals were sharpening their own ambitions. The problem for all of them was that the geopolitical structure of Mesopotamia made stable coexistence unlikely. The south was too rich. The river routes were too important. The ancient cult centers were too prestigious. And the memory of older imperial unity remained too powerful. Kings could not help imagining that they were the one meant to restore order to the entire land. Rimsin imagined it. The rulers of Eshnuna imagined it. Shamshi-Adad had imagined it. Soon, Hammurabi would imagine it too. But unlike so many before him, he would actually do it. When Hammurabi first appears in the sources, he does not yet look like the man who will dominate Mesopotamia. That is part of what makes his rise so dramatic. He begins as the ruler of a respectable but not overwhelming kingdom. He is surrounded by dangerous powers. He is constrained by realities he cannot simply command away. Yet over the course of his reign, he will turn Babylon from a regional state into an empire that rules most of Iraq and much of eastern Syria. He will do it with patience, intelligence, opportunism, and force. One of the turning points came in the shifting conflicts involving Eshnuna, Mari, and Elam. Eshnuna's king, Ebal-Piel, moved westward and captured important territory, threatening communications between Babylon and Mari. This mattered because Mari was not merely another ally. Under Zimri-Lim, it offered access to Western networks, strategic depth, and a political partner whose influence stretched beyond the Euphrates plain. Hammurabi and Zimri-Lim found common cause against Eshnuna. But the greatest external threat in the region came from Elam. The rulers of Elam were not simply raiders from some distant fringe. They governed a powerful kingdom rich in natural resources and strategically positioned along trade routes linking Mesopotamia to lands farther east. When Elamite power surged westward under the Sukalma, it posed a direct threat to every state in Mesopotamia. In 1767 BC, the Elamite ruler reached out to both Zimri-Lim and Hammurabi, requesting support in a campaign against Eshnuna. They agreed, not because they trusted Elam, but because Eshnuna was the immediate danger. Together, they helped bring Eshnuna down. But this success produced a new problem. The Elamite leader had no intention of stopping there. He wanted greater influence in Mesopotamia, perhaps direct control over key territories. He seized cities, made demands, and revealed ambitions broad enough to alarm even those who had recently cooperated with him. At this point, Hammurabi showed the instinct that marks truly consequential rulers. He adapted. He sought support. He recalibrated alliances. He understood that the immediate threat had changed. His old rival Rim-Sin of Larsa did not answer his call. Zimri-Lim of Mari did. Other powers, suspicious of Elamite motives, joined the broad effort to resist foreign domination. The Elamites were forced to withdraw. This was a huge moment. Hammurabi emerged from the crisis not merely as a survivor, but as a leader who could claim credit for securing the land against a major external threat. Whether or not he deserved all the credit is beside the point. In ancient politics, perception is power. He had helped repel an outsider. That mattered. It mattered even more because his greatest regional rival, Rim-Sin, had stayed on the sidelines. Hammurabi would now turn that political advantage into military expansion. His campaign against Larsa was not simply about territory. It was about who would inherit the south. Larsa had long dominated ancient Sumerian lands and key urban centers. To defeat it was to absorb not only resources and land, but symbolic capital. The war was hard-fought. One of the major episodes involved the siege of Mashkan-Shapir, defended by Rim-Sin's brother and large numbers of troops. The city eventually surrendered. Other cities followed. Reinforcements came to Hammurabi from allies including Mari. Then, in 1763 BC, Babylonian forces entered Larsa itself. Rim-Sin was captured. A ruler who had once stood as one of the greatest powers in Mesopotamia was led away in humiliation. With that victory, Hammurabi gained control over much of what had once been the Sumerian heartland. Ur, Uruk, Larsa, and the other cities of the Deep South were now under Babylonian rule. This was a transformation of immense scale. But Hammurabi did not stop. In 1762 BC, he moved against Eshnunna, folding it into his growing dominion. When Zimri-Lim of Mari failed to provide requested military support, Hammurabi interpreted, or chose to interpret, that as betrayal. Soon, Babylonian forces turned westward. Mari was taken, looted, and burned. This was no minor event. Mari had been one of the great cities of the age, a major node of diplomacy, commerce, and administration. Its archives would later give modern historians an extraordinary window into the world of Hammurabi. But in Hammurabi's own time, what mattered was that Mari ceased to be an independent counterweight. It had been neutralized. With Larsa defeated, Eshnunna absorbed, and Mari destroyed, Babylon had become the dominant power in Mesopotamia. This did not happen because Hammurabi was the strongest man in the world on the day he took the throne. It happened because he understood timing. He let enemies weaken one another. He took advantage of external threats. He used coalitions when necessary. And when the moment came, he moved decisively and without sentiment. That is the essential shape of his greatness. Not reckless conquest, calculated inevitability. For many modern people, Hammurabi's name means one thing above all: the Law Code. That famous black stone stele, with its nearly 300 laws, has become iconic. It appears in textbooks and museums and discussions of legal history across the world, and rightly so. It is one of the greatest surviving legal collections from the ancient Near East. But to understand its importance, we have to place it within the reality of Hammurabi's reign. The code was not created in a vacuum. It was the product of a king who had unified a vast and diverse territory, and who needed to present that unity not merely as a matter of conquest, but as the restoration of justice. This is key. Ancient Near Eastern kings did not usually present themselves as nakedly power-hungry. They claimed to have been chosen by the gods to establish order, protect the weak, uphold truth, maintain temples, dig canals, and to punish evil. Conquest was justified through justice. Hammurabi mastered that language. His law code covers astonishingly broad ground: theft, violent injury, property damage, debt, labor, marriage, inheritance, contracts, agriculture, irrigation, commercial fraud, tavern keeping, adoption, slavery, and more. It is not a democratic constitution. It does not imagine equality before the law in a modern sense. It is stratified by social rank. The punishment for injuring an elite man is not necessarily the same as the punishment for injuring a commoner or a slave. Yet the code reveals something powerful about Babylonian statecraft. It reveals a king presenting himself as the source of a comprehensive moral and administrative order. The famous eye for an eye provisions attract modern attention because they sound severe and ancient, and they are severe. But the code also includes many more practical and bureaucratic measures. What happens if a dam fails? What happens if a builder's work collapses? What happens if a field is flooded? What happens if a debtor cannot pay because weather destroyed the crop? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are imperial questions. They are questions asked by a king governing a large agricultural and urban society full of transactions, laborers, contracts, and risk. The code is therefore both legal collection and royal performance. It says to the people of Hammurabi's empire, Babylon rules because Babylon knows how society must function. And this message was amplified by everything else Hammurabi did. Documents indicate his constant attention to state affairs. He was involved in temple restoration, fortification, canal maintenance, diplomacy, provisioning, taxation, and administration. He was not a conqueror who lost interest once the battles were won. He governed obsessively. That obsession is one reason his empire became real rather than merely temporary military occupation. Yet there was always a risk. The larger the state became, the more it depended on Hammurabi himself. His capacity to balance regions, elites, cult centers, so expectations was extraordinary. But what would happen when he was gone? That question hung over Babylon even at the height of his success, and history would answer it harshly. When Hammurabi died in 1750 BC, he left behind something magnificent and unstable. That is not unusual. Founders often create systems held together by personal authority, military reputation, and momentum. Their successors inherit the structure, but not always the force of personality that made the structure work. Hammurabi's son, Samsu-iluna, became king in a world his father had transformed. For the first several years of his reign, the surviving records suggest relative order, economic attention, and temple construction. But beneath the surface, resentment and instability simmered. The South, in particular, had reasons to rebel. Cities like Larsa and Uruk had not forgotten their former autonomy. Local elites, displaced or diminished under Babylonian rule, still existed. Administrative burdens remained. Environmental and economic pressures could exacerbate discontent. Inflation and famine appear in the records for some regions during the 1740s BC. Then came the uprising. In 1742 BC, a rebellion began in Larsa under a man named Rimsin, often called Rimsin II by modern scholars, to distinguish him from the earlier great king of Larsa defeated by Hammurabi. Whether this rebel consciously invoked the old name to summon legitimacy or memory, the symbolism was obvious. He was not alone. Uruk revolted under Rim-Anum. Other cities, including Isin, Kazalu, Eshnuna, Lagash, Ur, and Nippur, also joined the wave of resistance or experienced their own upheavals. What had been Hammurabi's empire suddenly looked like a kingdom of fires.
Who would have thought a man of Rimsin sharing
At first, the rebels cooperated. Then, they turned on one another.
O Babylon!
Rim-Anum of Uruk broke with Rim-Sin II and aligned himself with Samsu-iluna. This mattered because it weakened the anti-Babylonian front and allowed the king to reconquer the rebellious cities one by one. The sources are fragmentary, but the result is clear. Samsu-iluna ultimately reasserted control over much of the south. He claimed to have killed or defeated at least 26 rebel kings and leaders. Babylonian royal rhetoric framed this as the restoration of harmony under the king's command. But victory on paper is not always victory in history. By the 1720s BC, large parts of the Deep South were slipping from Babylonian control. In the marshy southern reaches of Mesopotamia, a new power emerged, the so-called Sealand dynasty. The Sealand is one of the more enigmatic polities in Babylonian history. It controlled the southern marshlands and represented a persistent challenge to Babylon's reach. Its existence is evidence that the empire created by Hammurabi was already shrinking, fragmenting, and changing form. This is one of the central patterns in Babylon's long history. The city itself could remain prestigious, wealthy, and culturally central, even while the wider political structure around it fractured. Under Samsu-iluna, the monarchy still mattered greatly, but its effective command over all the territories once ruled by Hammurabi was no longer secure. That distinction would become more important with every generation. The final kings of Babylon's first dynasty are obscure compared with Hammurabi and Samsu-iluna. The records grow thinner. The political landscape becomes more difficult to reconstruct. Yet instability seems likely. The old confidence of the early empire had faded. Raids, border threats, and peripheral pressures continued. Babylon remained important, but its ability to project power was diminished. Then came one of the most astonishing episodes in the whole history of the city. From far to the northwest, in Anatolia, the Hittite kingdom was rising. Under Hattusili I and then his successor, Mursili I, the Hittites expanded into Syria and struck at major centers, such as Aleppo. In 1595 BC, after taking Aleppo, Mursili did something extraordinary. He marched to Babylon. This was not a short raid. It was a deep and daring penetration across great distance into the heart of Mesopotamia. That alone reveals something about the weakened condition of Babylonia at the time. A strong and coherent state would have been far harder for an Anatolian army to reach and sack. The details of the campaign are sparse, but the result is not in doubt. Babel fell. Its temples were plundered, its wealth was carried off, and most importantly, the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, was taken from the city. In the ancient Near Eastern imagination, this was catastrophic. A city's patron god did not merely represent the city. The god dwelt there, protected it, validated its kings, anchored its identity, and linked its earthly existence to divine order. To remove the god's image was to enact a form of cosmic kidnapping. It meant the city had been abandoned, violated, or judged. The Hittites did not stay long. Internal political problems in Anatolia likely prevented Mursili from converting his spectacular raid into permanent control. Soon after returning home, he was assassinated. But Babylon's first dynasty was finished. This matters for two reasons. First, it shows that even a city of Babylon's growing prestige could be shockingly vulnerable when the political structure supporting it weakened. Second, it marks a turning point in Babylon's identity. From now on, the city's history would be shaped repeatedly by the trauma of divine images being taken away and then returned. The presence of Marduk in Babylon would become a central measure of whether Babylon was truly itself. The city had risen under an Amorite dynasty. That dynasty was gone. A new age was beginning. After the Hittite sack, Babylonia entered a period of confusion and transition. Later texts gesture toward unrest and amorphous conflict and shifting boundaries. Out of this turbulent setting emerged a new ruling house, the Kassites. The Kassites came from regions associated with the Zagros. Their language remains poorly understood. In earlier texts, they appear as horsemen, mercenaries, laborers, and military specialists. At some point, whether quickly after the Hittite raid or through a more gradual process, they established themselves as the dominant power in Babylonia. What followed is one of the most striking examples in ancient history of conquerors being transformed by the civilization they ruled. The Kassites did not erase Babylonian culture. They entered it. They adopted Akkadian for administration. They patronized Babylonian religious life. They ruled from Babylon and over Babylonia in ways that connected them to older traditions. Over time, they became the longest ruling dynasty in Mesopotamian history. This is often misunderstood when later ages are simplified into neat ethnic succession. But ancient Mesopotamia did not work like that. There was no pure Babylonian essence waiting in a sealed container to be replaced by one foreign group after another. What mattered was participation in a prestigious civilizational order centered on cities, temples, writing, and kingship. The Kassites entered that order and eventually helped sustain it. But one of the key acts of legitimacy associated with the early Kassite period was the recovery of Marduk's statue. A ruler called Agum, in later tradition, was credited with bringing the divine image back to Babylon after its Hittite removal. Whether every detail of that narrative is historically secure matters less than the ideological point. The king who restores Marduk restores Babylon, and the ruler who restores Babylon claims the right to govern it. That ideological pattern would repeat again and again in the city's history. Under the Kassites, Babylonia was eventually reunited. The sea land in the south was conquered and incorporated. By around 1475 BC, the kingdom was once again a single political unit stretching from northern urban centers down toward the Gulf marshes. The Kassites called this realm Kardunish. Political reunification encouraged economic revival. Trade with the Gulf brought in needed resources such as copper and stone. Temple restoration resumed. Major building programs appeared. One of the notable royal centers of the period was Dur-Kurigalzu, a city founded by a Kassite king named Kurigalzu. It contained palaces, administrative buildings, temples, and a large ziggurat. The city symbolized both royal authority and the integration of the Kassite dynasty into Mesopotamian architectural and ideological tradition. The Kassite age is sometimes described as less spectacular than the eras of Hammurabi or Nebuchadnezzar II. And in some ways, that is true. But it was foundational in another sense. It gave Babylonia stability. It gave Babylon time. It allowed literary, administrative, and religious traditions to continue and deepen. The Kassites also forged important connections with older sacred centers such as Nippur, home of the Temple of Enlil. Even as Babylon grew in centrality, the old geography of holiness remained important. To govern Babylonia was not merely to control one city, but to position oneself properly in relation to a landscape layered with centuries of divine and political meaning. And yet, the very success of Kassite Babylonia would eventually draw renewed pressure from the north. Because while Babylonia stabilized, Assyria was rising again. North of Babylonia lay Assyria, a kingdom whose destiny would become inseparable from Babylon's. The Assyrians had once been constrained by larger powers, including the Mitanni. But by the 14th century BC, under kings such as Ashur-uballit I, Assyria broke free of old overlords and began its ascent toward major power status. This changed the strategic map of Mesopotamia. For much of the Kassite period, Babylonia and Assyria coexisted in a tense but workable relationship. There were moments of diplomacy, intermarriage, and mutual calculation. There were also border disputes, conflicting claims, and recurring clashes. One revealing incident came when the Babylonian king Bernaburius II complained to the Egyptian pharaoh that Assyrians were acting independently in diplomacy and trade. His protest reveals both his anxiety and a changing reality. Assyria was no longer a subordinate neighbor. It was asserting itself in the international system. A marriage alliance followed. Ashur-uballit married his daughter to the Babylonian king. Their son became king in Babylon, only to be killed in a rebellion. Ashur-uballit intervened militarily, killed the usurper, and placed another ruler on the Babylonian throne. That intervention is significant. It showed that Assyria was now strong enough not merely to contest borders, but to shape succession in Babylonian politics. From then on, relations were increasingly difficult. Babylonia remained prestigious and still powerful, but Assyria was becoming more militarized, more centralized, and more expansionist. The balance between the two kingdoms was shifting. By the 13th century BC, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I was ready to exploit that shift, and Babylon would pay dearly. Tukulti-Ninurta I is one of the most important and controversial figures in the history of Assyria. He was ambitious, militarily successful, and intensely ideological. Under him, Assyria reached new levels of confidence and aggression. At some point in the 13th century BC, he launched a campaign against the Kassite king Kushti-Liash IV of Babylonia. The reasons remain debated. Border disputes likely played a role. So did the increasingly asymmetrical relationship between the two states. But Assyrian propaganda framed the conflict morally, as a matter of oaths, divine justice, and Babylonian wrongdoing. The Tukulti-Ninurta epic casts the Assyrian king as a righteous avenger and Kushti-Liash as the breaker of sacred obligations. Whatever the ideological packaging, the result was devastating. Tukulti-Ninurta defeated Kushti-Liash, captured him, and invaded Babylonia. Babylon itself was taken. Its walls were broken. Its wealth was plundered. The temple, Esagila, was violated. Most shocking of all, the statue of Marduk was carried off to Assyria. This was not merely military victory. It was sacrilege, and even many Assyrians seem to have felt the weight of that fact. Babylon was not like some distant mountain stronghold or tribal region on the Imperial edge. It was one of the great sacred centers of the Near East. To sack Babylon was, in later analogy, like sacking one of the great holy capitals of the modern religious world. Tukulti-Ninurta placed governors over Babylonia and dominated it for 7 years. But the conquest was unstable. Elamite attacks struck vulnerable areas. Local resistance persisted. Puppet kings ruled briefly. The whole arrangement smelled of overreach. Eventually, a Kassite prince, Adad Shuma-usur, rallied enough support in the south to expel Assyrian control and to take the Babylonian throne. Meanwhile, Tukulti-Ninurta's own fate was grim. He was assassinated in a conspiracy involving his sons. The episode is one of the clearest examples in ancient Mesopotamian history of a conqueror winning magnificently and then failing politically, because he had violated something larger than immediate strategy. He had humiliated Babylon, and Babylon, though wounded, would outlast him.